Hello, everyone. My name is Guillermo Rogel, and I'm the Legislative and Government Relations Advocate with Front and Centered. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We know that there are a lot of organizations that are doing these kinds of legislative briefings and, a session starting on Monday, this Monday, January 9th. A lot of folks have a lot on their plates in the climate and environmental justice space, along with all the other pieces of legislation that folks are tracking. So we really value your time. And as we go through this presentation, you all are welcome to drop questions into the chat that will then get filtered to me or to our policy staff as the presentation rolls on. So here's a little bit about what we're going to cover today. We're going to do a welcome from our good friend Rosalinda Guillen up in Skagit. We will cover our legislative session budget priorities, along with our Transportation, Energy, and Growth Management Act priorities. We have many other things that we're tracking in the legislative session this year, but we're really here to highlight the issues that Front and Center is going to be leading on. So if our members from our coalition are here today, if you have pieces of legislation you're working on, please connect with me, with Sierra or Rebecca, just to make sure that we're aware of those. But yeah, I'll go ahead and kick us off with an introduction to our team. So today you will be hearing from Rosalinda Guillen. As I mentioned, she is on our Front and Centered Community Council, really our core group of members that kind of manage the day-to-day operations at Front and Centered, really help guide us as staff. And then also Rosalinda is also the founder of Community to Community, has really worked and dedicated her life to environmental justice, working for farmers' protections and their rights. So we're really happy to have her here today. You'll also be hearing from Paulo Nunez Bueno. He's our Transportation and Land Use Policy Lead, along with Marielle, who is our Clean Energy Policy Lead, and Sierra Suofoa McLean, our Program Engagement Lead. So we have a good group of folks here at Front and Centered, but we are really guided by our member coalitions, by our 70 community-based organizations. So with that, I will kick it off to Rosalinda, who is going to give you all an overview of who we are and why it is that we have a legislative agenda in the first place. So with that, I will kick it to Rosalinda.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. So happy to see you here today. It's actually pretty exciting. We're entering the 2023 legislative session. And as usual, it's a big time of the year for all of us that do advocacy at the legislative level. Front and Centered is a network of organizations, an alliance led by people of color-led organizations. And so those of us that participate in Front and Centered are the communities that have been, there's a technical name for us, right? Underserved, marginalized. There's all of these vulnerable communities, but we're not. We're actually pretty strong organizations, pretty strong communities that have been structurally left out of the process. And I think that what's important about Front and Center is the way that we engage in the legislative process is that we engage community members from the ground up, and we look to make sure that the issues that are really important to our communities are focused on. So the legislative agenda that you're looking at right now is what community members have brought to us. We are led by ourselves in a structure that is increasingly more and more democratic and collective decision-making, which I think is what we enjoy. We have a community council that represents organizations like our organization. We're a founding member of Front and Centered because we've learned that organizing on the ground is important and we have victories on the ground. But if we're not changing the regulatory and the policy environment to sustain the changes that we win through very, very hard fought organizing on the ground, then it just disappears. It's like an non-ending circle of struggle without changing the actual structure. And that's what we called the just transition. So we're transitioning from this struggle and changing systems on the ground to moving it to the infrastructure of governance. And I think that for us at Front and Centered, our organization and farm workers, which right now I want to mention that Edgar Franks and um, Alfredo Juarez and Marciano are in Olympia right now, actually talking to legislators about the just transition framework as it relates to the food system, to the agricultural industry, and to farm workers. Front and Center is a very important alliance for us to be a part of in creating a shift in the agricultural industry and in our food systems. We invite all organizations to please take advantage of our structure to be able to create these changes. This legislative policy our agenda that we're going to look at is really important for us to be able to participate together. And we're trying to make it not complicated. We're trying to make it understandable, valuable, and actually results oriented to what our community needs. So I welcome everybody that's listening today. There's been a lot of work put into this, but we need more work. We need more of your support and more of your participation. Because honestly, our legislative agenda is only as strong as the participation of our member organizations. Guillermo and Derek and the team that Guillermo just mentioned, we're open to listening and to trying to understand what your needs are so that your participation becomes not heavy, but a labor of love and necessity for the changes that you want to make in your community. We're here to support you in any way that we can to enter and break down those barriers at the legislative level so that the policies that are implemented actually do make a difference to everybody in our community. You see this beautiful photo. This is the summit that we had, which was, a policy summit in a community-based summit where there were many discussions on what our policy agenda has to be or should be, but also what does the organizing on the ground look like to be able to make those policy and regulatory changes that need to be made for our communities, which really, we're the only ones that can decide that. And we're the only ones that can make it work. So I want to hand this over to Guillermo now to really look at what the legislative session looks like. And I want to thank you, Guillermo, for not making this kind of presentation and introduction a heavy load for us and make it interesting and actually understandable. So thank you very much, Guillermo, for all your good work, the Front and Center team. And again, welcome to everybody.
Thank you, Rosalinda. Yeah, and as Rosalinda mentioned, all of these priorities are community-centered. And we really want to make sure that we are listening and practicing environmental justice in our work. And so with that, really want to lead that environmental justice goes hand in hand with all climate-related policy. For us, environmental justice, community participation sits at the core of what we do. And as you know, we're already facing the impacts of climate change, but we know just based on the work that we do on the ground that frontline communities, overburdened communities, really are experiencing the effects of pollution and climate change the earliest, the most, and they also have the least amount of resources that are provided to them by the state, by the federal government to actually address these issues. So we want to make sure that as we do our advocacy and our centering environmental justice, that the legislature, that the governor, that state agencies, external partners, other environmental organizations are also centering environmental justice in their work. And we really want to make sure that environmental justice is not just the definition, but that it is something that folks practice in their day-to-day activities. And with that, as we head into the 2023 legislative session, we know that we are implementing the HEAL Act. So for those of you that have been following our work for a few years now, you all know that we were instrumental in forming the Environmental Justice Task Force that then actually developed into the HEAL Act that passed in 2021. The HEAL Act accomplished a few things. For one, it defined environmental justice into statute. So this is that as we are working on environmental justice issues as front and centered, as nonprofits, as community-based organizations, we are using the same definition as the governor's office, as state agencies, and are implementing that definition in multiple ways. And one of the things that I'm really excited to see that the HEAL Act has actually been able to accomplish is a cultural shift, is that now state agencies in their planning, in their budget decisions, as they're forming legislative priorities, they are considering what it is that community members want. They are starting the process of actually doing community engagement, which is shifting the way I think that we are holding state agencies accountable, that we are holding the legislature accountable. Because for us, I saw it, especially as folks were campaigning in the 2022 cycle, they were making commitments to environmental justice, to climate change. And for us, we want to make sure that it's not just a talking point, because I think we've even seen it at the federal level where, folks are adopting language such as environmental justice into their work, but their policies or their practice in which they reach those policy recommendations are actually not reflective of what the community members want, are not community-led solutions. So this is where we're really excited that we are actually seeing the HEAL Act get fully implemented. And we're really excited for the prospects of that and what it means for the state of Washington. Part of the HEAL Act also created new obligations to fund overburdened communities. So there are goals in the HEAL Act that actually say we need to set aside 40% of state budget, of state spending into overburdened communities. We have to prioritize overburdened communities because they are feeling the effects of climate change first and worst, because there are so many health disparities that exist in their communities that are causing their life expectancy to drop, that are causing folks to have asthma, cardiovascular disease. So if we are not centering and prioritizing overburdened communities, we are really missing a crucial part about addressing the climate change crisis that we are facing today. Something that is also exciting is that there's new members of the state legislature. Folks from both parties are going to get the opportunity to learn what is environmental justice, why is it that it's so important to addressing the climate crisis, and what is it that they can do, what kind of commitments can they make, what kind of community members in their districts can they talk to that are proposing either policy or budget solutions that are going to make an impact on their lives. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we are supporting policy, that we are supporting budget priorities that are going to make a difference in people's lives. There was also a new chair to the House Environment and Energy Committee, Rep. Beth Dolio. So we are excited to partner with her and see what kind of new ideas it is that she brings to the table, and really look forward to the different partnerships that we are going to be able to create with this new structure, with the new House Environment Committee and the Senate as well. So going into this session, Governor Inslee dropped his budget for the 2023-2025 biennial, for the biennial budget. For us, we're really leading first and foremost with transparency and accountability. There were, as I mentioned, legal obligations in the HEAL Act and as a part of the cap and trade program that actually have legal obligations for how certain money is going to be spent. For us, if projects are not going to be reducing carbon emissions, or if their proposed projects and spending are actually going to increase health disparities or exposure to pollution, that really goes against what is in the HEAL Act and what is in the cap and trade program that folks have proposed. So for us, we were working with community members to really identify, okay, if we have hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to be spent in existing revenue, in new revenue, what is it that folks would actually want to see that are going to make an impact on people's lives, a positive impact on their communities? And we were outlining a few things. So you'll see those in the second bullet point. Under A is the community participatory climate and environmental planning and budgeting. Really what that means is that as state agencies, as the state legislature is getting together to create a huge spending plan for the next 2 years, agencies, the legislature and the governor really have to work with community members to decide that spending. We have a representative democracy. I think we've seen that it functions in some places, but there are areas that can actually benefit from community members actively participating in the planning and budgeting of these dollars. For example, we have been able to work with the Environmental Justice Council, which is a newly formed council out of the HEAL Act, to decide, okay, as agencies are doing this planning, as the governor is getting ready, what kind of priorities, what kind of values should we lead with? And this is one of the first ones, is if you are not actively engaging with folks who are impacted at the community level, you're really missing a big piece of the pie there. The second one, which Paulo will talk about, is actually getting money into our public transportation system, because there is a big gap there. In climate resilience, and this is where Rosalinda, I think maybe you can add a piece to it. is we really want to make sure that there is support for workers and communities when it comes to climate resiliency, whether that's hazard pay, whether that's weatherization. We really want to make sure that there is funding dedicated to that, because there are many folks who are facing the impacts of high heat. Maybe they are out on the fields for an extended period of time. They are the ones gathering our food, but they don't have any kind of resources to actually support that. Rosalinda, is there anything that you want to add on the climate resilience piece?
That is actually what farm workers are at the Capitol talking about today. The climate change, the heat rules are not good enough. And actually, in the latest budget that was just passed or approved by the governor, they did include several $millions for this climate resiliency support, including a hazard pay fund, or that's what we're calling a hazard pay fund. They give it some other fancy name. But I truly believe that if it wasn't for Front and Center and the support from all the organizations and this policy team, it would not have happened. So it was a combination of direct action by farm workers at the governor's mansion, at the legislature, and also working with Front and Center Policy Committee and putting pressure on them. So this is actually already moving in the right direction. But as you know, with everything in our communities, we have to keep our eye on it, and we have to keep the pressure up until it's actually happening on the ground with farm workers. So that is a really good point. This is the way we win for our communities.
Thank you, Rosalinda. And the last one two more. So Mario will cover D in energy affordability, weatherization, and healthy homes. But just to cover green infrastructure and food systems, we want to make sure that there's support for ecological restoration that reduces pollution and prevents disaster. So we want to make sure that there's actually funding available for that in the communities that need it the most. So just to touch on Governor Inslee's budget, after cap and trade, he led with environmental justice. So we want to make sure that it is clear that the governor's budget is actually meeting these obligations to fund overburdened communities. So this is something that we're going into this legislative session seeking. Is like as Senator Rolfes, as Representative Ormsby, the environment and energy chairs are working on their budget. We really need to see a detailed outline of how is it that they're meeting these obligations, because at the end of session, we're going to have to tell our communities, this is the kind of funding that you could expect. This is how you can access it. And these are the impacts that we hope positively impact your community. It's a people's budget. We want to make sure that people are actively, our community members are actively involved in making those decisions, and really is our role to help facilitate that. So now I'm going to kick it off, as I mentioned, on B, the frequent accessible public transportation. Our transportation and land use lead, Paulo, is going to talk to you all about what transportation justice means to us and what we do. So Paulo, how is it that transportation justice fits into our just transition framework? And
well, I'm glad you asked, Guillermo.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks, Guillermo. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We're really excited to share this with you all and to invite your voices into the advocacy that we'll be doing in a few weeks when the session starts. So, transportation justice. Transportation in Washington State and really throughout the country is a big cause of climate change gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, as well as pollution that harms people today and is a source of tremendous inequity across our state. You know, almost a quarter of the people in the state are non-drivers, people that can't drive either because they can't afford it, or they have a disability, or they're too young. And the vast majority of our policies and the lion's share of the money that we spend in transportation doesn't reduce greenhouse gases and doesn't make life easier for those people who don't have the privilege of relying on a car. And in other ways, transportation is a source of enormous inequity. People of color are much more likely to die as victims of a car crash as pedestrians. The exposure to pollution from highways is also something that is very, very inequitable. So, Guillermo, hit the next slide, or the next down, please. And one more. Keep hitting till stuff shows up. And if it doesn't, then I'll just talk because I can see it. So what we're proposing is a transportation justice agenda that really changes the way in which we have approached the way that we do transportation from top to bottom. So the first element there, I see Guillermo struggling, but don't worry. The first element is to just stop the harm. We need to stop building highways in the overburdened communities. So a lot of times what you'll hear from people is, well, there is no alternative. That's just the way we do things. But that's just not acceptable. Our communities have been the recipients of an unfair amount of the pollution and the impacts that come from our transportation system. So Black and brown people breathe in a lot more pollution than they create. And the reason for that are these historical inequities. Where did we put the highways? We put the highways in the communities that were redlined, that back in the 30s and 40s, this racist policy said these communities where people of color live have no value. And that's a good place where the expansion of the interstate highway system can go. Great that the legislature last year passed Move Ahead Washington and has a lot more support for transit and other non-highway expenditures, but it has 12 projects, 7 of which are expanding highways in the communities that have the highest environmental health disparities. Number 2, we really, really need to set targets for success. So let's have clear targets for building the missing sidewalks. We have an epidemic of bad walkability in this state. And let's build back our transportation system so that we have much better access to this life-changing service for everyone, which is called frequent transit, that runs 7 days a week, that allows people to access opportunities. And then number 3, our communities are calling for us to put the dollars where our mouths are. if that was terribly said, but let's make real investments that actually solve the problem, right? We have made token investments, and in terms of transit, and in terms of sidewalks, and in terms of active transportation, and we're calling for us to make real investments that will achieve the targets that we are calling for. To just close out and to make sure that folks understand this, the state funds and the federal funds for transportation, when they go to transit, they almost entirely are focused on capital, which is great, but is not enough. Everybody can understand that it's great if you can buy more buses, but if you can't pay for the drivers to drive them, then it's not really helping our communities. So we want to make fundamental changes in the way that where we put the burdens, and fundamental changes in how we make progress in solving both our climate challenges and our equity deficits in our transportation system.
Thank you, Paulo.
Yep.
So just so folks are kind of in tune going into session, the first 2 we're looking to be policy priorities, budgets that have yet to pick up a sponsor. But if you all sign up for our newsletter, which you will get the link at the end, we want to make sure that these are actually something that the state legislature follows. So if there are partners in the transportation sector that you think would be interested in some of these, definitely reach out to us. We already have some members in mind who can help us accomplish these. The last one that Paula mentioned We're really looking for a set of data that just currently doesn't exist, that we are going to have to get access to in some manner, either through a budget proviso, through a study, directing the Department of Transportation to get this data. So these have legislative components. It's just a matter of time and willingness from the legislature to pick these up and get them across the finish line this session. So thank you, Paulo. Now we're going to transition into the our energy justice piece. So I will kick it to Marielle and ask Marielle just where is it that energy justice fits into our just transition framework, and what is it that you're expecting out of our energy justice proposal going into this session?
Thank you, Guillermo. Front and center is prioritizing the interests of moving towards universal access to clean energy, sufficient clean energy for all Washingtonians. That's a part of our just transition picture because energy being critical to life, to the economy, and just making sure that people and the environment are able to be sustained. And so in particular, a lot of our attention in recent years has been around access, ensuring that the energy is clean and ensuring that it's accessible, and that those operate on similar, in tandem with urgency. And part of that has been trying to push for energy for all, the idea of a universal standard for access. And one proposal we had previously was around setting a standard around energy burden and meeting energy assistance need through a minimum cap on how much could be charged for energy bills, how much people had to pay to cover getting energy for their residential needs. And our focus currently is on looking at a bigger picture. We've looked at information that's coming in through utilities who are trying to comply with the Clean Energy Transformation Act, doing assessments of low-income needs and kind of determining that a lot of eligible customers using for their electricity and gas services are not having their needs met. The Department of Commerce has conducted a study, has basically pulled together data that was reported by utilities in complying with the requirement to report their implementation of CEDA. That's determined that there's still an enormous gap in meeting the need for energy access in Washington, and that gap is being addressed by kind of a patchwork system where different utilities have their respective programs, and federal funding covers programs here, and some of them are bill assistance, and some of them are weatherization, and some are actually supported more by kind of community level and localized kind of efforts and by partners. And it's a system that offers something for a lot of people, and it doesn't offer enough for everyone. And so we are hoping to pull together interest for all entities, particularly energy utilities, critical agencies, Department of Commerce, and stakeholders to try to centralize all of those initiatives and have a program where information, standard setting, and services live. And so that is a proposal that we're developing now for an energy trust in Washington that can both address gaps in information on what is the need, where's the burden, how can we ensure that all people in Washington, particularly those who are most vulnerable to harm due to being shut off or disconnected for non-payment, vulnerable to extended outages, and are not accessing programming for solar, for efficiency opportunities around distributed energy, weatherization, just getting their homes in a place of readiness to address the climate impacts that are leaving people with higher bills and less of an ability to just keep their homes warm and their food refrigerated and their medications refrigerated, and everything that is sustained by electricity and gas for Washingtonians. That's kind of part of the question and part of the picture. We also want that centralized system to incorporate information gathering as to the effectiveness and performance of discrete programs and protections. And we're very much in support of any protection that will keep Washingtonians kind of connected to the power they need, particularly in times of high vulnerability, including winter weather, which we're all experiencing now in Washington, and extreme heat. And we know that there is a bill that is going to be in front of the legislature this session on an extreme heat moratorium that we are closely following, and very interested in ensuring that that protection is kind of addresses community needs for expansive protections, and hoping that we can explore the idea around consolidating, collaborating, and centralizing a more comprehensive energy assistance system into a mechanism that includes input from stakeholders, critical entities, and access to the public to some direct services when those are not being met by their local provider or by local partners.
Thank you, Mario. Yeah, and just to really put an emphasis on that last point, we're encouraged, I think, by the proposals that are out there right now. We really just want to make sure that it doesn't matter what utility district you're in, that you pay rates to, that you have access to a centralized energy assistance program, and that you are protected not just during the winter moratorium or the proposed summer, like extreme heat moratorium, but that you are protected year round. We really saw, especially during the COVID pandemic, that if folks had access to their basic needs, to shelter, to water, to energy, to heat, it actually helped keep our residents alive and healthy. So we're really trying to build off of those protections. If you do have questions on this proposal specifically, our coordinators are putting the emails for Marielle in the chat. So thank you, Marielle. We are going to shift now to our Growth Management Act that is going to be met by our program engagement lead, Sierra. So Sierra, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Guillermo. So I wanted to just start by kind of describing or explaining what the Growth Management Act actually is. So it was a law that was enacted in the 90s, and it determines or requires that fast-growing cities and counties in Washington State actually develop a comprehensive plan to really consider all the things and the changes that are happening in our state and in these local areas to make sure that people in power are making decisions. Within the actual act, there are two main parts. One part are these goals, which are not really enforceable. They're very aspirational guidance pieces, and there's about 15 of them. And then they actually, they're, like I said, they're not really enforceable, and they're very general. They're not super specific. Then there's this other piece of the elements, which are actually enforceable, which means they could be like, you could sue on them in a lot of cases. There are 8 of them, and all 8 of those are mandatory, but there's also a voluntary one, meaning that planners could go beyond the 8 to plan for other things that aren't in the act, but they don't have to. Those ones are a bit more specific. They have a little bit more requirements to them in specificity about what planners have to actually do. So that's a little bit about the Growth Management Act. I know it's not a super common thing that I grew up knowing about in Washington, so I wanted to just share about a little bit of that. So can you go to the next slide, Guillermo? Thank you. So the reason that we've been doing this work on the Growth Management Act is that we know with the HEAL Act, it defines environmental justice in state law, and it requires the state agencies to take action on environmental justice, and that's great. But we also want to take that work down to the local level, and we want our citizens and our Black and Brown communities and low-income communities to be able to have input on the planning process, because we know that it impacts our lives and it impacts us often disproportionately, right? So the proposal or the policy that we're putting forward this session requires city and county planners to actually address the environmental health disparities that the overburdened communities and vulnerable populations in our state face in those comprehensive plans. More specifically, and this is listed on the slide, this would require planners to identify the overburdened communities and the vulnerable populations in their planning jurisdictions. It would require them to identify the actual disparities in the environmental health disparities, and the disproportionate environmental impacts that they face, and then to actually start making the plans to address those things so that we can reduce environmental harms and create the environmental benefits that we deserve. And then the last piece of what we're pushing for is more targeted resources for our communities and like organizations like Friend Centered to actually be able to participate more in the planning so that it sort of decentralizes a little bit of that power. So we're very excited. We do already have a sponsor. Representative Dewar in the House is going to be taking it on, and hopefully if we decide that we need a companion bill, we will find a Senate sponsor. So we're very excited. Some of this work, I will add, comes from the SB 1000 bill in California, which has been around for a couple years. We definitely took some learning from how that's been going in the writing. And there was actually a task force in the legislature, or that the legislator, decided to have, that we did meet with, and our coalition met with them and internally to create this proposal or policy. So we're very excited about it.
Thank you so much, Sierra. So yeah, just so you all know too, you all might be familiar with HB 1099 from last year, which was trying to get climate as also an element and a goal in the Growth Management Act. So Representative Dewar is also going to be pushing that one too, along with FutureWise, who we partnered with last year and are going to be partnering again this year. So there might be some questions that you all hear about why is it that they're separate. For us, it really is, the work has been done a lot on 1099, has been baked with stakeholders. We are really trying to make sure that this carries forward and gets the attention that it needs, and are planning to see this all the way through to get this to the governor's desk this time around in this session. So thank you, Sierra, for that presentation. So with that, I just want to make sure you all stay connected to Front and Centered. The way that you all can do that is signing up for our newsletter, which we will get the actual link in the chat right now. But if you all want to be updated more, you can reach out to myself at Guillermo@frontandcenter.org, Paulo, our transportation lead, at Paulo@frontandcenter.org, Marielle, here, and Sierra here as well. For those of you that maybe joined in a little bit late or want the slides, we will be sending out a recording of this briefing once we have the video downloaded and everything and have it captioned. And we will also be sending along and accompanying the slides and our one-pagers for each of our legislative priorities. And as you heard, our GMA bill is sponsored. We are in conversations right now to get our other bills sponsored. So if you do want to stay connected about who it is that is going to be sponsoring the rest of our bills, have ideas about it, or just want to join the advocacy space, feel free to connect with us in our respective emails, and we could go ahead and get you that information. And we also just want to make sure that we make time for questions. Thank you, James, for putting in the newsletter link. So you can see it. James just put in, it's frontandcentered.nationbuilder.com. You can click that link and it'll take you to sign up to get more information during the legislative session. And then I see a question. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. I see one about from Annabelle. When you say you don't have data, do you mean data on the gaps in transit service? And Paulo just put in the question. We have data on transit service gaps. Spoiler alert, the gaps are real and significant. And then you can check out our transit access map. Paulo, do you want to give a really quick overview about that, what that access map is? And yeah, do you want to give just how to use that website really quick?
Yeah, absolutely. We would love for everybody on the call to go and learn how to use the transit access map, and then maybe we can schedule some workshops around how people can adapt it to the advocacy that they're doing. But in essence, what it does, it's a tool that lets you slice and dice who has access to different kinds of transit throughout the state. So, the spoiler alert is 69% of people in Seattle have access to frequent transit, and in Spokane, as we're going to see here, it's about 3 or 4%. So if you click at the top, Guillermo, where it says transit frequency, transit service by frequency, and then go to the left and say, oh yeah, stay there and hit the second one down below where you are. Yeah, then we can see the percentage of population that have access. So scroll down a little bit further. Keep going, 3%. So what we don't have data for is how much of this network is accessible to people who need to walk or bike or use a wheelchair to get to the transit stops. It's kind of shocking, but in very significant ways, our policies for sidewalks is still stuck in the 1800s. We don't have data, and we also make the repairing, the maintenance of sidewalks the responsibility of the homeowner, which has an enormous equity impact. Because can you imagine if you're somebody who's just struggling to pay the mortgage and your sidewalk fails and the city comes to you and says, you owe $10,000 to fix this sidewalk. And at the same time, for people that rely on the sidewalk, they're relying on whether their neighbors can afford to pay to repair that or not. We don't do that for other basic services. We don't say, hey, you have to put up your own electricity lines, or you have to build your own sewers. And so it's time to change that. And like Guillermo said earlier, we're working to get either a budget proviso or even a much bigger investment from the state to as soon as possible get our hands around the data of where do we have sidewalks and where do we not have sidewalks, and start that benchmark so that we can start building up those missing critical pieces of our communities.
Thank you, Paulo. Rosalinda, I think I saw your hand go up.
I just wanted to say really quickly that this whole issue of data, when it's related to policy and then budgets and how money is spent, this is a really weak spot for our communities, because the way that the data is collected is, as Paulo just mentioned, doesn't fit our needs. And so big decisions on large chunks of budget dollars are made based on this data. And I think with front and center, like the EJ map and now this transportation map, it gives us a way for us to be able to correct this and try to align our community's needs more with the way that the money is being spent. So I just wanted to mention that your participation in gathering this data from the ground up and then presenting it in the policy, especially in the decision making with budget dollars, is really, really critical moving into the future.
Thank you, Rosalinda. There was another question about the HEAL Act implementation, and saying that one of the challenges that a lot of community-based organizations are feeling is that there's no planning or ramp-up time, and limits in the time frame to spend down. I think maybe Chio, you might be referencing there was a grant that went out in December for $400,000, and an RFP that I think they released it and then gave maybe like a month to put together a proposal, and then you have to spend that money over a certain amount of time. Yes, like I think in a lot of ways funding like this can be inaccessible. I think that was almost like a pilot that we are still not sure where that grant is going to go. But what we really want to do is make sure that there is funding behind community engagement and planning, because part of the HEAL Act is community engagement and actually connecting with overburdened communities. So I think for what we want to see is long-term spending, long-term plans, either from Department of Health to partner with community-based organizations we, for example, at Front and Center would really like to get some funding because we have a lot of community-based organizations that we're able to contract with pretty quickly, just because we have that partnership. And that's a lot different, right? Is partnering with an existing coalition like Front and Center, where we already have those relationships versus maybe working with an agency that you have to go through these really formal processes, dedicate a lot of time to putting the proposals together, have an idea of how you're going to spend it. So we do want to see more investment on the community engagement side of things, more granting to community-based organizations, because we know that's such a critical component to getting really proactive, really sustainable and productive community engagement going. So yeah, Chia, that is something that we are definitely paying attention to and going into the session prioritizing. Rosalinda, is that an old hand, or do you want to say something?
Well, it was an old hand, but Laura announced, but I do want to say something is that your access to budget dollars and the way that the systems are structured in the legislature and in the agencies like Department of Commerce, I want to say our organization has like $450,000 sitting in Commerce because of the way that we're supposed to access it. It is really difficult for small community-based organizations to follow their process. So there's so much change that has to happen in order for us to actually access dollars. But the other issue is the community engagement. I sit on the EJ Environmental Justice Council that was formed through the passage of the Climate Commitment Act. One of the things that we've learned is how almost non-existent community engagement is in every single state agency. Their process and the way that they've structured their community engagement to get feedback, especially from communities of color, overburdened and communities, it's almost not there. I mean, it's a ridiculous, there is almost nothing. So with Front and Center, for us, this is the best way for organizations to really get some information in a way that is accessible. So this community engagement dollars are becoming more and more critical as the climate changes keep happening, these climate incidents that are, crisis. So this is work we all have to do together. And I'm so happy that we've got all these folks participating.
Thank you, Rosalinda. I see one more question. Will the Energy Trust be policy bill introduced or a budget focus? It will be a policy bill. And if anything changes, it might turn into a budget proviso, but I don't see that happening at the moment. I think if there are any more questions, staff, is there anything I missed? Okay. So just want to thank you all again for joining this briefing. Please stay connected, follow us on our social medias if you have it, and sign up for our newsletter, and please feel free to reach out to us at our emails if you have any questions or follow-up. So with that, we will close the briefing. And just a reminder to our policy committee folks that we will be rejoining this exact webinar at 1:30 for further discussion on our legislative agenda. So thank you all so much, and we will see you all soon. See you down in Olympia.